Well, even though this isn't our regular time, Dan would fill up with good, and people will continue to come in. We're all happy that Dan Arvizu is in Sydney this week, and he started his Sydney trip by coming here. And he arrived probably on the 6:30 flight this morning.
I did.
And he's been here all day, and he says he'll stay here, he'll work with us all night. So many of us have known Dan for a long time. Dan was probably the first sponsor of silicon research here when he was at Sandia Labs. So Dan joined Sandia Labs in 1976, and he was also one of the first sponsors of my research at the University of Delaware. So many of us go back pretty far with Dan. And I'm going to try to remember some of Dan's accomplishments. I won't get them right. But
it's okay.
Dan's been he actually went to Sandia Labs in 76 and became the director of NREL 10 years ago. So it's our 10th anniversary.
Right.
That makes him the longest serving director. And his appointment, well, he may last forever. We hope he does. And actually, Dan has a whole bunch of things. I have to read. I'm going to have to read
Yeah,
some of
please
these.
don't do that.
But he was appointed to a 6-year term at the National Science Board by Bush 43, or President Bush, and he was reappointed by President Obama, which probably makes him one of very few people who, well, that speaks well to him. You're now the chairman of it,
I'm chairman
of the National Science Board, and they actually supervise the National Science Foundation and a whole bunch of other things. Dan is an accomplished manager leader. This is a senior renewable energy job in America. He works directly with the Secretary of Energy, the Assistant Secretaries, Congress, the President's staff, and the good news is he's one of us. And Dan was just elected to the National Academy of Engineering, making him the third NREL person, the first being an earlier director, the second being Larry Kazmersky, and the third being Dan. And that's the highest level engineering position in America. So with that, we welcome our friend Dan.
Thank you, Alan. Thank you, Ellen, and it's a real pleasure to be here. And I'm remarkably, I think, got my faculties, but based on the fact that I just got here this morning. I've had a chance to go out and do a quick run around the harbor and the Opera House. It was invigorating. I'm not sure if I'll collapse later on. I probably will, but it's really a pleasure for me to get a chance to come and spend a little bit of time here at the University of New South Wales. It's an institution that I have great fond memories of, and again, as Alan mentioned, I think in the early 80s, I was in a unique position of being able to sponsor university research really around the world, and this institution at that time was one of the world's best. And it continues to be so. And so it's always a pleasure for me to come back and get a chance to meet some old friends and talk a little bit about the things that we're doing both at NREL and more globally at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory as well as the national program. Lots of things to say, and I'm actually here because there's a conference going on in the next couple of days on energy productivity. I was on a commission that kind of was looking at, in the U.S., how can we double productivity in the country by 2030, and what kinds of things can we do? And we put some reports out, and as a consequence of that report and that commission, President Obama actually adopted some of the recommendations, and in fact now, as part of his climate action plan, talks about doubling the energy efficiency or productivity of the country over the course of the next couple of decades. So I'm here to meet with a number of federal officials and also a number of colleagues at this conference on Wednesday and Thursday. And also we've got a lot of media type of interest as well. So you may see me at least hopefully mildly coherent in some of those interviews that'll occur over the next couple of days. What I do want to talk about is really a big picture. One of my colleagues, our director of our National Center for Photovoltaics, Greg Wilson, will be here in a couple of weeks, and he's going to do a deep dive on our solar programs and all the things that go along with that. He's much more expert at telling you the specifics, some of those than I am. I'll hint at some of those things and talk a little bit about the things that Greg is doing. But more importantly, what I'll talk about is the things that I'll be focused on over the next few days here as we talk about to your thought leaders and officials regarding kind of what the status of distributed renewable resources and making a transformation of our energy system. So we start from a perspective, and also I'll be a little bit global in my view, and then I'll get a little bit more specific on some technologies. I'll start with this notion that we think, in fact, quite confident that the energy system that we have today, both in the U.S. and globally, is not a sustainable energy system. It's one that we need to transform. We need to transform it in very dramatic ways, and we need to be about doing that very quickly. And it's not happening as quickly as many of us would like, and as a consequence, we need to kind of get out and talk about technology, policies, markets, the things that are important. So I'll start with a little bit of a kind of what's the state of kind of energy in the globe, in the world, and specifically what we do know is global renewable energy is actually growing. It's actually growing at a fairly brisk pace. $250 billion spent last year. Well over $1.5 trillion have been invested over the course of the last decade or so. It has slowed in the last couple of years, and that's the investment going forward. So the industry is still growing, but it's facing many, many challenges, and those people that have been in the business for any period of time are recognizing how challenging it is in terms of continuing to sustain businesses. And so there's a resetting in some areas of the sector, and it's particularly challenging for a variety of reasons. Public policy continues to evolve. I know that's certainly on everyone's mind here in Australia, certainly in the U.S. as well. We've, in the U.S., primarily driven by state policies, not by federal policies. Federal policies are modest relative to what's going on at the states. The states, we have mandates and a variety of other things. And even those are being reviewed now in terms of the new environment that has a couple of features to it. One is that we're still suffering from the effects of the Great Recession. The Great Recession, in many respects, continues to linger in many parts of the world. In the U.S., one of the things that we do at the National Science Board, which again Alan mentioned earlier, is to send out a 2014 Science and Engineering Indicators document that's kind of a global snapshot of where things are. And in that report, which just came out just a few weeks ago, we concluded that in the U.S., economic output has rebounded. It's rebounded very, very quickly from where we were prior to the recession. However, job creation has not. And that has a lot to do with the dynamics in the private sector. In the private sector, what you're seeing is that people are getting leaner and meaner and a lot of additional things that really relate to productivity, but it doesn't necessarily relate to jobs. And so there's a little bit of a dilemma, a dichotomy there that we're trying to deal with, but it's all kind of effects of the Great Recession. In the U.S., it's no secret, shale gas has become a hot topic. It's a big discussion, and it's a discussion in our political arena as well as in our technical arena. One of the things that's very, very clear is that we're going to have low energy prices for a long time to come. Don't know how long that is, but it clearly is one that's changing the landscape. It's changing the landscape, especially for alternative resources like renewables. And people ask the question, so is natural gas a friend or an enemy of renewable energy? And our response to that is it's a frenemy. It can be a friend. It can also be an enemy. I think in general, we embrace the idea that it's a good thing to have those kinds of resources. But you need to have the long-term interest in mind, because if you don't think about where the long term you're going, we will, first of all, lose the opportunity that this presents, and second of all, I think put ourselves in an even more difficult position than we are currently. So we come back to that a little bit later. Infrastructure. So depending on where you are, if you're in the developed economies, infrastructure is aging and it needs replacement. If you're in the emerging economies, you need new infrastructure. All the demand for new energy is really going to be in the emerging economies. And what we're finding is in the developed countries, especially the U.S. and Europe, what you see is flat energy demand to declining energy demand, primarily because we're getting more efficient. And in fact, the needs that will be forthcoming in the future, different type of sector evolution going on. And there'll be a focus on both resilience, for those of us that are in replacing aging infrastructure, and also on things that really relate to what I call flexibility. I'll get a lot more about that here as time goes on. I'm going to go really quickly through some of these. So last year that the REN 21 kind of came out with an assessment was 12. If you look at the 13 numbers, are not too different than this. We now have over 500 gigawatts of renewable energy capacity deployed globally, which is pretty amazing. I can remember in the late 70s, early 80s when we talked about things in terms of kilowatts. And then we went to megawatts. And then more recently, we've been talking about gigawatts, and now we're talking terawatts. It's a half a terawatt out there, which is pretty impressive. And I think before long it'll be exceeding a terawatt. So lots of activity out there. You can see the numbers there. China has overtaken pretty much anyone else in the business. They're now well over 100. They're about 120 gigawatts of deployed renewable energy capacity. The U.S. is pushing 92 or something like that. There's 100 gigawatts of solar PV, which is actually quite remarkable to me, that there's that much PV deployed. And of course, that's due to a variety of things, the costs coming down, the manufacturing investments that have been made in China. You see here, and this is just intending to show that there's really investments everywhere. Only in Asia sector has the investments continued to grow, and in every place else, the last couple of years you've seen a downturn. I think that'll rebound over time, but right now that's kind of the mode that we're in. You see in terms of where technology is being deployed, it's being deployed pretty much everywhere. Obviously, China and the U.S., the two big players. Europe obviously is a big player. Emerging economies also, India and Africa and a variety of others will soon, I think, catch up. South America as well. You'll see a lot more of those technologies moving forward. I've been part of a number of studies that have tried to opine or at least come up with some sort of quantitative analysis of how much can we get? Is there enough resource really to meet the world's needs? And independent of which one you look at, I was part of the ICC Renewable Energy Study, I was part of the Global Energy Assessment, a number of other things that have come out of the EIA and the IEA. Bottom line on all this is technical potential for renewables is enormous. And I think we've gotten beyond, is there enough resource out there? In the U.S., we've actually done one step even more refinement on that, and we've looked at the thing. We have a couple of studies. The one that I'll focus on is this Renewable Electricity's Future study. In that particular study, what we did is we did a parametric analysis of if you wanted to fast forward to the year 2050, could you meet the load that is projected to be in the U.S.? No technology, disruptive breakthrough kinds of stuff, but just technology evolving as we would expect it to. And then you did an analysis, and then this was a many multitude of authors and institutions that got together, and we did an assessment. And we did it, and this is not a prediction or a projection, it is a parametric analysis of what might you expect if you wanted to do, we started with 50%, 60, 70, 80, 90, and even 100%. We actually focused on a scenario of 80% and asked the question, and we did a deep dive on that. And it turns out that you can now, in terms of dispatch, economic dispatch, and all of the things that one would look at when you look at can you meet the load in the year 2050 with an 80% renewable energy target, you can do that. And it can be done cost effectively and with modest amounts of investment that you would need some transmission in the U.S. But it really does begin to nail down this notion of not only is there enough resource, can it actually be deployed where you need it in the time frame at an hour-long basis. And we're refining those studies even more. Not surprising, you take full advantage of all of the resources that are across the country. We've now started to institute that same analysis in a number of other countries because they're asking the same question, can we do it elsewhere as well? I think the answer is pretty clear. Yes, it's a matter of looking at those things more specifically region by region. So we're not any longer asking the question, can it be done? Now we're asking the question, how do you do it? Because frankly, now that we know that it can be done, now that we know that it's not an overwhelming barrier, and we've got, in the last couple of years, I know at NREL, we've put out literally dozens of studies that look at a variety of things, everything from the specifics of how do you, what are the ancillary services that you might expect from PV or wind or any other technology, and how does all that fit into the mosaic of the things that policymakers and others and vendors need to understand. So we've done a lot of those things, and suffice it to say, we start looking at those things region by region, specific technology by technology. I was recently a part of a study that we did in California called the 50% renewable study. And what if the utilities were concerned that the very progressive legislature in California would be mandating 50% RPS. Now, it turns out that they didn't mandate that. What they mandated was that the PUC chair actually defined what that number could be. It could be actually more or less. They already have a 33% RPS on the books, and they were saying, if we went from 33 to 50, what would that do? And this is by the year 2030. And we looked at it in great detail, and I was part of what they call the independent advisory panel, myself and a couple of other key folks that looked at all the assumptions, looked at what they were doing, why they were doing it, and in fact looked at the results. And I'll come back to some of those results here in a minute, but suffice it to say, you can get to 50% if you choose to do that. Right now, California are on the path for meeting their RPS standard, which is 33%, and they'll probably exceed that by the year 2020, and in fact probably get to 40%. That is not without some challenge. So you have to do some things differently. I'll go back to that also in a minute. So there's one slide you want to take away, kind of the key features of what I'm trying to say today. It's this one here, is if you want to get to these higher penetration of renewable energy into the energy system, you need to really focus on a couple of things. So bottom line is you need a lot more flexibility than we have today. You need to be able to deal with variable supply as well as variable use. We already, the utilities can deal with end use variability. They do it all the time. They're not necessarily putting constraints on the consumer on when you can use electricity. They will accommodate whatever it is we choose to do. In the future, we need to be able to not only deal with variable end use, we need to deal with variable supply. Obviously, this is recognizing the variability of both solar and wind. And in fact, what we find is that there are ways in which, and this was very prominent in the California study, that if you want to do this thing smartly, it depends on whether you're looking at the future as a central station-centric future or a distributed-centric future. It's a big difference in how you view the world. If you're kind of a utility that in the U.S., these investor-owned utilities are all big power plants, big wires, very central station, okay? They have a vision of the world that says, you put on these variable things, it's really hard for us to manage, all right? If you have the mindset that I'm thinking big power plants, big wires, you get to a very different answer very quickly from those who believe that a distributed resource is really the future. Where now you've got not just this notion of big power plants, but distributed power plants, where the consumer is actually a producer. We call them a prosumer, right? What we're looking for is those areas where now you have a lot more local control. Now you need a lot more flexibility in the system. You need two-way power flow. You need distribution networks. You need incredible IT services. You need information gathering. This is a very different world than the world that we would incrementally go to if we had, to move from a central station world to a distributed world. And this is really where the big challenge is. And the challenge has to do with changing the business model. The business model for electricity generation in particular, but it's also true of other things, has been focused on this notion that unless you are moving the electrons, and that's really your end product, is commodity sales of electrons, that future is very unstabilizing to what I think is reality. Reality is, I think we're going to go to a distributed model. The question is, how quickly will we get there? That's the real matter of fact, I think, that we need to deal with. It'll be driven by regional considerations. It'll be driven because, certainly in the U.S., we've kind of given up on, and I shouldn't say this in a public forum, but we've kind of given up on our federal government to lead the way. That's not going to happen. In the U.S., it's happening grassroots. It's happening bottoms up. It's happening because it's in the region's local economic development interests. It's because that's what's driving innovation and the new future. And that essentially allows the region that's forward-moving and forward-thinking to actually benefit most from making investments in those regions. So what we see is a variety of things that really relate to, I think, a new world order relative to distributed resources, and it's got to be done very, very differently again than the system that presently we are saddled with. At the end of the day, it's my certainly a strong expectation that what we'll see is an incredible opportunity for new innovation. We'll see, this is really where the green jobs will occur. They're not going to occur because we're going to have a lot of installers putting solar panels on rooftops. Well, there'll be some of those, but frankly, the real opportunity is in selling energy services, not selling electricity as electrons as a commodity, but selling services that electricity offers you. And those things have to do a lot with, again, where those benefits come to the consumer. And I'm on the board of a major insurance company in the U.S. And one of the things that we talk about in the boardroom is what happens when we have intelligent vehicles, and all of a sudden the cars don't crash anymore. What insurance are we selling? What are we doing in terms of the business model? What happens when homes get really, really smart, and all of a sudden you can monitor what's happening in your house and all the pieces that go with that, and you ask the question, if in fact I have a house that's now much safer from fire and a variety of other things, damages that would normally occur, what does that do to the business model for the insurance company? Well, so one of the things that we think about in that boardroom is, well, you need to think about the services that you provide. And in fact, if your service is risk management of everyday life for individuals, you can begin to package some products based on information that they have in their system that allow them to do something very, very different than we had ever imagined before. It's because we have the information. Already we have the little devices that you put into your automobile, and now we can tell how everybody drives. We can tell who's a high risk and who's not. In the U.S., I know we drive on the other side of the road there. If you take left turns in the U.S., okay, that's a higher risk than if you take right turns. I think it would be opposite here. But you can see why. Because when you're making the turn, you're exposing yourself to a very high degree of risk situation. And they monitor that stuff, and little incremental changes in that risk perception, in fact, provide a different pricing mechanism for that particular type of a driver. And a variety of other things, how fast you start, how quick you stop, a number of other things that really relate to the risk profile of a particular driver. All of that is just informatics. And you'll see a lot more and more of that as we talk about the infrastructure for electricity as well as the other ones. So this is really an important slide, and really if you take nothing else away from the talk, take that away. It's really an important thing. Really, what we look at the national program is how can you reduce the risk of the private sector investing in these technologies so that we can get to this new future of transformed energy management, in particular around electricity and around fuels. A lot of things that are part of that, and I think, again, the national program is focused both on technologies and also understanding what are the policies that are necessary to make that new future happen. All right, those are kind of the things that we end up with. I'll say a few words about technology, and I'll fast forward through these because I know much of this is familiar to many of you. But in the U.S., I think one of the things that we're looking at is what's the end game? In our PV area, obviously we're now about 13 gigawatts in the country. And a lot of and the costs have come down dramatically. There's still a lot of cost, I think, to relay in that. At our laboratory, we're working on kind of next generation materials. So everything from thin silicon with multi junction or multi layers that give you some tandem type of opportunities for increasing the theoretical efficiencies, I think are important. One thing that I've got to build here. I'll go quickly through these. One thing that we're recognizing is that there's a lot of science still to be determined, especially in the thin films that we've pioneered at NREL, and looking at material defects and improving material performance. We think there's a lot of potential still left there. We're seeing a number of this is a chart that we like to use. These are the theoretical efficiencies for many of these material types. The green is the actual commercial module efficiencies that you're seeing in the marketplace these days. The yellows are the champion cells that you see in the laboratory, and those gaps are getting smaller. And very, very quickly, I think you'll see both SIGs and CAD-TEL modules getting to 16-17% very, very quickly. And I noticed perovskite's the new material that everybody's talking about these days is already with champion efficiencies over 16%. So we're beginning to see, and some unverified ones I think at 18% already that we haven't yet measured. But I think there's plenty of opportunity in the material space that is really being one of those things where I think we see great promise. Stay a word about wind. It's kind of the workhorse. There's over 320 gigawatts globally. There's 60 gigawatts in the U.S. I think 70 plus in China and growing. Big, I think, opportunity for this technology to really begin to take a place in the overall mix of things. In the U.S., the president has been very adamant about essentially investing in renewable energy. We've actually doubled the amount of renewable energy in the U.S. from 3% to 6% of our generation is now non-hydro renewables. We're up to 13% if you include renewables, hydro rather. So it's actually a big number. Lots of really interesting things going on in this arena. Going back to basic principles again, one of the things that we're doing, we have this new thing called Atmosphere to Electrons. It's our new kind of initiative. What it's looking at is improving the performance of wind farms, starting from basic principles. It's a computational fluid dynamic problem. I'm a mechanical engineer, so particularly interested in this particular type of research. And what we're looking at is the turbulence wakes of individual turbines, and then also being able to, with LIDAR and a number of other techniques, to actually forecast what the wind regime looks like and tailor the actual performance of wind turbines sitting in an array, in real time, and you can improve by up to 10 to 20% of the performance of a wind farm, and that translates to many millions of dollars in bottom line in terms of the wind farms that are presently in existence. So a lot of good research that's going on and really working. Again, we'll look at offshore wind turbines as the next generation, but a lot of things that are going on there as well. Biofuel is another area of great interest. We continue now. We've moved beyond ethanol. We're not working on ethanol anymore, although we see some of the residual, cellulosic ethanol programs, I think, now beginning to find their way into the marketplace. Frankly, we're looking now at using biofuels as a drop-in fuel. So you take, cellulosic material and essentially either through a thermochemical platform or through a thermochemical or a biochemical platform, either one, to get to a molecule that is very close to what we have in terms of gasoline or petroleum, and then you can upgrade those in a refinery, use existing infrastructure. One of the things that's kind of exciting to me is this notion of going to a premium fuel, where you have an alcohol plus a gasoline blend, and then a high compression engine to go along with it, an IC engine to go along with it. Very exciting in terms of the number of things that you can do with that. And one of the things that we're working on is how can you optimize both the vehicle and the fuel together, because these are all system level problems. Geothermal, another area where I think there's a great deal of promise. There's a lot of geoscience work that has to go on, and specifically around enhanced geothermal systems, EGS we call it. We've had some major breakthroughs, or at least technology developments in both fracking and in horizontal drilling. Many of those technologies were pioneered in the geothermal program, and enhanced oil recovery, which I worked on when I was at Sandia many years ago. But we're now taking those and trying to now apply those same techniques in enhanced geothermal. I think you'll see some breakthroughs in that in the next few years. Efficiency. I'm here really, again, talking efficiency at this other conference that I'll be at. We still waste well over 60% of primary energy content in our fuels that we use for all kinds of things in our system is inefficiencies in the system. We use, these are the percentages that you have in each one of these various sectors in terms of the amount of energy essentially used for the sector. And so we have a great deal of opportunity here. And I frequently say, it makes no sense to shove green electrons into a very inefficient system. And I think it's still true today. I've been saying it literally for 20 years. And I think it's something that we really need to get our head around. Because frankly, unless you really deal with efficiency first, the optimization of the generation is really much more challenging, much more difficult. I'll say a word about buildings because it happens to be one that we spend a lot of time on in the U.S. So 40% of our energy consumption is in buildings. If you look at both a commercial and a residential system, you can see kind of the breakout of where you spend money. So if you look at a commercial building, and one of the things that we did when we had the opportunity to build some new infrastructure on our own campus is we looked at that chart, and you got 20% for lighting, 16% for space heating, 15% for cooling, and 9% for ventilation. Well, you add all those together, well over 50% of the consumption of a building is in HVAC and lighting. 50% or more. So, and then there's other piece down there at the very bottom, which is all other things, plug loads, a variety of things that go along with that. And we decided to attack that, which we did. And it's very interesting because what you can do, this building on the upper left-hand corner is actually the building that I live in. That's where my office is. It doesn't look like your opera house here. It's a pretty engineer, pedestrian sort of building. But what it does is it allows you to be incredibly efficient. What we've figured in the Colorado arena, you can essentially throw light about 20 meters, 60 feet. And so these corridors are each 20 meters wide. And then there's 4 or 5 stories per corridor. We have 1,350 people that live in this building. This building has 2.5 megawatts of solar PV on it, and this and the parking garage that's next to it. And on an annual basis, it generates more energy than it consumes. So it's a net zero energy building, all from solar. Interesting enough, and we've done everything in there. First of all, it's 100% daylit. So if the sun is shining, you don't need to turn on the lights, no matter where you are in the building. You can. We have LED lights everywhere, but you don't have to turn them on. And second of all, we put very, very well-insulated walls and windows and everything else into the building so that you can essentially have a very small HVAC power plant. When you do that, what you find is that you can downsize the actual HVAC system of the building, and it reduces the cost dramatically. So overall, that building actually, and here's the best part of the story, that building cost us less than a building built to code in our area. So my budget was $300 a square foot. We built it for $259 a square foot. You add the PV panels, it was $286 a square foot. Less than a building built to code in our area, and it's net zero energy, which makes it kind of pretty phenomenal. It's the largest, most efficient, it's the largest net zero energy building in the world, to my knowledge. I keep saying it everywhere I go, and I haven't been challenged yet, so I'm thinking that's true. So the good news is that it is a testament that you can do these things, and you can do it in today's environment. So a lot more to be said about that. We look at these things from a campus perspective, and we look at it from, in our case, we're trying to be the example. If you go to the National Renewable Energy Laboratory and we're not doing what we tell other people that they should do, then we're not very good stewards or not very good ambassadors for what we're trying to do. So we've really focused on not only our buildings, but now our campus, and looking at it in a broader perspective. Here's an interesting set of numbers. So we've, in the course of making this move to a more sustainable campus, we've reduced our energy intensity by over 30%. Here's what occupants do to a building. All right, so if you look at the baseline versus where we are in the Art Research Support Facility is the name of our building, you can see what the colors are the different things that cost energy, if you will, and we monitor all that stuff. So we're looking at it, everything from equipment to computers to data centers to everything else. We look at it. Here's the interesting part. Every person in our building gets an energy budget. And they get 70 watts, okay? So you can see what we do here. So rather than have a 300-watt laptop computer, you get a 30-watt laptop, which is a thin client, which is a kind of a virtual laptop. You get LCD monitors that are also 30 watts, as opposed to 300 watts of normally a screen that you wouldn't use that particular technology. Task lighting, it's all LED. Voice over IP type phones. And then we don't allow people to put those little space heaters underneath their desk, where you can kind of warm your feet. So that's contraband in our building. You can't do that. What you do, though, is you're able to have everybody monitor what they're doing. And what you do is you just measure everything, and everybody is attentive to the idea that occupant behavior really matters. And in fact, you can see it as people begin to interact with the building. We measure everything. We actually have a campus meter that you can go to the web and look at and say, okay, how are we doing relative to what we're supposed to do? You can drill down on a building. You can say, how are we doing on this particular building? Here are all the measures and metrics that go along with that particular building, and we can tell kind of how we're doing on a real-time basis. And we have a kind of a target profile of how the building is supposed to perform, and if it gets out of that target, it kind of raises the flag, and now we can say, hey, what's going on there? What happened, between 1600 and 2800 hours, and what do we need to be? Did something get out of spec or whatever? So that way we monitor everything. It's amazing to me how much that data offers us in terms of the opportunities. We actually have a data center in that building. It's the world's most efficient data center. We have a new high-performance computer we put in a different building that also has won the Presidential's Green Gov Award, a number of things that go along with that. And the new high-performance computing, it's a 1.2 petaflop computer. It's the 30th largest or fastest computer in the world. And it's dedicated entirely to renewable energy. We had the Secretary of Energy come out and do the ribbon cutting on it. It's called Peregrine is the name of it if you want to Google it. But essentially what it has is essentially a new type of technology that HP is monitoring and will be exporting worldwide in terms of their new data centers, because it's, again, a new way in which we do that. That was originally it started to be a 5 megawatt computer. It's less than a megawatt, and we take that megawatt of heat that it generates, and we actually heat our building with it. And we have a little bit left over, so we actually heat the sidewalks. So in the wintertime, we don't have to clear the snow off anymore. So this is all a part of the new future for buildings. We do the same. We're trying to do the same thing with transportation. Transportation is much harder. You have a number of fewer options. To the president's, I think to his credit, he's doubled the CAFE standards, the corporate average fuel efficiency, and that's an important piece because we're at 27 miles per gallon, and now we want to move that to 54 by mid next decade. And it's a hard thing to do. You've got to do lightweighting of materials. You've got to do a variety of other things. Actually, we've got several different things. We're working on batteries. We're working on lightweight materials. We're working on biofuels, as I mentioned, biofuels with high compression engines, where that might be another approach. Working on hydrogen technologies, and more recently, we're now working on CNG, natural gas powered vehicles as well. All of this because, frankly, there's not, I don't think, a winner just yet in terms of where we're going to go with transport. There's a lot of opportunity space here, and I think there's a lot of things that we can do better than we have in the past. I'll kind of end with systems integration. Systems integration is really kind of the next big thing for us. When I was asked this question, literally 4 or 5 years ago, so you guys are now, you're doing well on the generation side. What's the next big thing? The next big thing really is energy systems integration. It's not just electricity. It's electricity, fuels, thermal, data, water. All of these infrastructures will interact with one another. Right now, it takes a lot of water to generate electricity, and it takes a lot of electricity to move water. So you've got these incredible amounts of synergy between these various infrastructures, and this is the next thing that we're doing. We're going to focus on grid modernization. That's our next big thing that we're doing within our laboratory. We have a new facility called the Energy Systems Integration Facility, and it's looking at how do you now integrate all of these now high penetration renewables and also distributed resources in a way that allows you to really take full advantage of the things that are more part of the future, in my case, in the case that I mentioned earlier, which is a distributed energy-centric future. Back to that California study that we were part of, if you go to 50% renewable energy in California, what you will find is that it'll be about 85% of the new additions will all be solar. And what you'll end up with is this incredible peak in solar right in the middle of the day. Now, normally, that's where you had the peak of your load. But because of the dynamics and the way that's working, what would happen in the future is you'd push that load peak well into the evening, which is kind of what we're seeing already. What we determined in that study is that really what you need is several things in order to accommodate that oversupply in the middle of the day. because the utilities' answer to oversupply in the middle of the day was to curtail the energy. That was because they are in that central station centric approach. And so this is a utility study, and we said, wait a second, time out. That's old think. New think is to use this in a much more productive way. And there's ways to do that. First of all, you would focus on storage, you would focus on demand-side management, you would focus on more of a distributed set of energies, technologies, generation technologies, and you would focus in the U.S. on something which we're having difficult doing because it's a political issue, and that is energy imbalance markets. Meaning, instead of California going it alone, partner with your states that are bordering California. So Arizona and Wyoming and Utah and Nevada, all of those states have tremendous generation capabilities. And if you just make your regional imbalance market larger, you can take full advantage of all of those pieces and in fact end up with a much lower cost, highly integrated, much more resilient energy system than you would if you didn't do that. So these are things that are necessary, and in fact what we're doing in our facility is trying to reduce the risk of this type of integration. We see the integration at the first of all at the resource level. This is the level I just was talking about. So putting all these pieces together, this is the integrating the technologies. Then we see several other layers. There's a local control layer, that's a regional layer. There's a cyber layer that goes on top of that to make sure that you've got the right kinds of features in your system. There's a systems control layer, and ultimately there's a market layer. These layers would offer tremendous opportunity for innovation. There's a lot of information, two-way flow kind of based technology that I think that is necessary. And much of it is already kind of in play. It's just not being wired together in any kind of a framework. And this is the framework that we believe is the future of our energy system if you're going to make it resilient, affordable, and environmentally benign, and ultimately sustainable from all the perspectives that we see. It's an exciting future, but it's very, very different than the one we have now. So you have to integrate location, campus. This is on the physical scales, distribution, bulk, as well as on the time scales, all important. And I end with this. It's really about innovation. We can invest in innovation and really make the future a lot different than it is today, but we need to invent that future. It's not the future that will occur if we just incrementally move our technologies the way we have been doing for the last 100 years. You need finance, you need people who are going to make investments, and you need to be able to make that investment in an ROI sort of way. And then ultimately, we're kind of all in it together. We've got to partner on a global scale. So those are the key messages. Those are the ones that we I think are focused on. I'll make this presentation available to you on our website. Just go to nrel.gov, look up the director's page, and it'll show up there, and you can have access to it. Okay, thank you for your attention.
I know Dan will take questions. I know there's a bunch. I know certain people just don't agree with me.
Good afternoon, Professor. The research that's being done between renewables and storage of energy. Could you comment on what you're doing or what is being done on storage?
Yeah, so the first thing I'll say is not enough. I think storage is an enabling technology. It's a technology that ultimately I think can be a catalyst for changing the business models much more rapidly than anybody imagines. In the next week, I'll get a chance to visit with Elon Musk. I'm not sure if you know who Elon Musk is. He's the founder of Tesla Motors, also the founder of SpaceX, and he's got a bunch of other crazy ideas that are pretty forward-leaning. He's just building and he also is I think the chief investor in Solar City, which is a vertically integrated now these days solar services kind of company. He sees storage as the opportunity for a tipping point, and he's going to invest, I think, very soon. That's part of the reason I'll be talking to him in a large battery manufacturing facility. What Elon Musk does exceptionally well is automation. He does things that he can do at scale, and he's independently wealthy, so he doesn't depend on anyone but his own resources to make those things happen. As as a matter, if you think batteries are kind of the future, and that's kind of where I think many people believe, I think we've got a ways to go. I mean, if you look at our battery technology and where we are, we're at least a factor of 3 today from where we need to be in terms of cost effectiveness, both on a density metric as well as on a power energy density and power density metric. And I used to run an R&D shop at Sandia on essentially storage, and electrochemistry moves really, really slowly. I'm particularly impressed with how slowly it moves, and so I'm not a big fan of how quickly this is going to change the world. On the other hand, certainly in the area of electricity, you don't necessarily need storage. Demand-side management will do the same thing as storage will do. If you have the ability to measure in real time, to meet the ancillary services of the utility, and to look at stability of the system, and no one in my world is advocating 100% renewables. We're advocating a mix of thermal generators as well as renewable in a way that they work well together so that you get highly reliable and efficient systems. You need flexibility in the thermal units. Thermal units have to be able to ramp up and ramp down. Today they don't. The natural gas is giving us that capability as we move away from coal and to natural gas. We're finding that that's certainly a great value that those two bring. Storage is really important. Until we get to 20-30% renewable penetration, variable renewable penetration, it's probably not essential, but it is important, and it can be accommodated in other ways. So we don't do enough, in my opinion. We don't do enough on that. We don't do enough on carbon capture and storage, because I do believe there's a role for fossil fuels, but they has to be done in an environmentally responsible way. So there's a number of things that all kind of play together. And storage is a piece of that, which I think, again, ripe for more investment, and we simply don't invest what we should. It's a small program without the kind of vision that I think is necessary.
Does that tend to push you towards distributed systems in renewables to alleviate or minimise that storage feature?
I think what we're seeing mostly is the expectation right now in the U.S. is that more than half of our new energy investments for new resources will come from natural gas. It just happens to be the cheapest thing and the fastest growing one. More than 30% of the balance, or more than 30% of the additional new resources will be renewable energy. So we're seeing a move toward that's being driven primarily by mandates at the state level in the U.S. Very soon those mandates will be satisfied. And when they do, there's a question mark as to what else will we do. I think a lot of it has to do with how quickly some of these technologies will demonstrate that you can manage renewable resources in an electric grid that really wasn't designed for that, with additional investments that are made at the distribution level. So there's a move in that direction, but frankly, I cannot predict what the future is going to hold. What I can predict is that we're going to get to 30% probably renewable energy probably in the next, as a nation, probably over the course of the next decade plus.
Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I'll just thanks very much for your talk. I tell my students about this building in the course that I teach, so I might have to pinch some nice slides off.
You're very welcome.
Just following on from that on storage, it was an interesting comment there. When you're talking about carbon capture and storage, I guess I'd be interested to talk to you about that and sort of counter that move towards more activity in carbon capture and storage by saying it'd be interesting to look at the energy requirements of compressing that CO2 and the sorts of pressures that are needed to get them underground. I guess my counter argument would be I'd be interested to see why not, if we're going to compress something, let's compress air and use that for storage. At least we get something back. Mm-hmm. If we're compressing CO2 and putting it underground, I suspect the energy costs would be quite enormous.
You bring up a good point, and it's one that I failed to say, but we should say, and that is, once we define the attributes of what we expect in our future energy system, we should really be technology agnostic. We should really not care which technology is going to get us there. If it gets us there, if we've defined, low carbon footprint, the life cycle costs of the energy, all of those things that you've just pointed out, water usage, water footprint, all that kind of stuff. If you've defined all that up front, then it's a marketplace. Bring the best technology. I happen to like the opportunities that renewable resources have under that scenario, but I'm not one to quickly dismiss the nature of the fact that we've got a marketplace that really we want to generate as much innovation as possible once we define those outcomes. But we need to define those outcomes. In the U.S. we have this, okay, so now we've found this great, natural resource of shale gas, and there's a whole segment of our population that says, great, problem solved, we're done. No, not even close. By the year 2040, the MIT studies and others will tell you very quickly, if you want to reduce carbon emissions as we do, that you have to start thinking about how do you reduce the carbon footprint of natural gas by that time frame or sooner, or else you're essentially going to blow right through all the carbon targets that we've set for ourselves. So if you care about those things, and I was reminded by the President's Science Advisor when he heard me say that, he says, Dan, make sure we do care about those things. I don't think he speaks for all of the American public, but he certainly speaks for the administration. And I think what the thing is there, I think, is that we need to think about what endpoint do we want, and then really it's a free-for-all as to who can get us there quickest.
Richard.
Yeah, Richard.
Okay, thank you. Moving on, you mentioned that you're in favor of being technologically agnostic. And so in that vein, I'd like to ask you the question about having a renewable energy target within an emissions trading scheme, an overall emissions trading scheme, or an auction-based direct action scheme, as our Prime Minister is seeking to come down the track with. I'd like to get your view, is there a need to set aside a particular part of the market, 30%, 40% monopoly for renewable energy, or would you be in favor of technologically agnostic and whatever is the most cost-effective emission abatement, let the market decide?
I'm very much a free market person. I love the idea that the market can decide. The unfortunate part, certainly in the U.S., I won't speak for other regions of the world, is the energy sector is incredibly highly regulated. It's regulated in a way that has, over the last 100 years, rendered it devoid of innovation. When you get right down to it, the amount of research that we spend in the energy sector per unit of sector sales is 0.3%. There's not another sector in our economy that's 0.3%. Pharmaceuticals are 20 plus. IT industry is in the teens and 20. You have to invest in that innovation. And now this is not an indictment of the players in that sector. What this is a consequence of the public policy that we have that says that this sector. And in the U.S., I can understand why we did that. We did that 100 years ago because we thought fossil fuels were plentiful, limitless, and would always be cheap. And all three of those have now proven to be false. So now it's time to rethink our public policy. So I'm a free market guy, and I think that's great, but we put barriers. We still subsidize fossil fuels at a much greater rate than we subsidize any of the alternative fuels. Now, try that one on the U.S. politicians and you get your head handed to you, because I've done that. All right? So I get that, understand that. And really it's more about let's have a conversation that actually meets the realities of what we're doing. And I think we're starting to have that in the U.S. It's taken a long time. But it's challenging. And now when I talk to utility executives, we have a whole spectrum. Very, 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 very progressive ones and ones that not so much. The progressive ones recognize that the future is different. The future is different than what it has been. And if they want to continue to have a business model that continues to generate revenue for the shareholders, which is their job, that's why they exist, and they should do that well, they need a different business model. And they need regulators to help them. So we're working with the regulators to try to understand that better. Because again, there's no right or wrong here, and this is not to vilify any sector of our economy, whether it be oil companies or whether it be utilities. The fact is they are very predictable, they're very rational. They do exactly what their business conditions dictate of them. And if we the influence makers of policy, and I'm not a policy maker, but hopefully I'm providing credible information to the policymakers, that in fact what they really need to do is something quite different than that meets the objectives of what we're really after. But we need to have a very, and in fact you can't turn on a dime. These things will take time, and there'll be multiple cycles. But it's better that we're having the conversation that says, what do we want to end up with, rather than doing abrupt things. Some of these instruments, whether they be mandates or anything, are very blunt instruments. And they kind of overcome a number of the other barriers, but there's as much challenge in rationalizing, why are you doing that, as you have with those who are trying to keep the status quo. These are very, very challenging sorts of issues. And anytime you change the value distribution in that sector, you're going to have a lot of folks resisting, and that's really the challenge. The challenge is to have a grassroots effort, and I'm looking around the room at the younger crowd, because frankly that's really where I think we'll see the greatest amount of movement. When I go to universities, I get a lot of positive reinforcement that they get this. My generation, I'm a lot less confident that our folks are going to change. And I think, my generation is probably going to have to die off before we get to the changes that are necessary. It will take time, and I think there's a principle that I like to talk about, which is if you really want to change this much, you need to be able to credibly say what the benefits are. And it's easier to say no to something if there's a greater yes, and we're really looking for that greater yes. That's really what it's about.
Will the political pressure for the contribution from the states to reduce their regulations as opposed to the Fed have more sway? How do you see that?
Yeah, I think the states are driving. No question in my mind, the states are driving, and the states see it as an issue of local economic development. It really is about creating jobs, benefits, and value to that particular region. And those that get in front of that train typically will be the ones reaping the benefit. Not all regions are the same. Every region has a different set of assets. They got a different set of political drivers and business drivers and resources, and you need knowledge workers. All of those things have to come together, and unless you have all of those ingredients, you're probably not going to be very competitive. So what I see is there's pockets in the country, and some of the unlikeliest places where you see those pockets. In the deep south, in the U.S., where typically you've got a very conservative population, I see a great amount of innovation and creativity going on in those areas, but very, very specific regional pockets, and not so much uniformly across the country, and frankly, I don't think that situation will change in the country.
There could also be regions within particular states.
No question. No question. Absolutely. Yeah, over here.
Thanks, Dan, for a really, really interesting talk. Richard Corby.
Hello, Richard.
I heard what you said about regulation before. I think we're very, very carefully listened to that. But specifically, how do we bring the incumbent industry, the electricity industry in particular, who is really on the death spiral, I think, and they know it in one part of their brain, but they're actually not really reacting or don't know what the next is, and the more innovative side of the community who want to do something else with the electricity infrastructure. They're not really seeing each other's arguments, and not really, at least in this country, talking to each other as equals and engaging. And it's sort of a bit mutually suicidal. How do we get them together? How do we make it work?
Yeah, that's a great question, and doesn't have an easy answer. I know in our region now. I was amused. I've been reading a little bit about the Australian energy mix, and I noticed your electricity is about 70% coal. Colorado, where I live, our electricity mix literally 8 years ago was 70% coal. We've got lots of natural resources, as well as lots of distributed and alternative energy resources as well. So Colorado was the first state in the U.S. where the voters actually voted a mandate for renewables. very surprising that that would happen. We are what we call a purple state, meaning it's part red and part blue. And so we've got a very, very diverse population, put it that way. So our local utility company actually came out and spent, I don't know how many tens of millions of dollars coming out against the referendum when it was first proposed. The people voted it in. This is a state that votes in no new taxes. We're pretty conservative in that respect. We voted in this renewable energy standard, and I don't even know why they did it, to be honest with you. I didn't live in the state at the time. And at the end of the day, the XL, our utility, they operate in 11 different states, said, okay, you know what? We're being forced to do this. Let's get on with it. Let's just do it. The chairman of XL Utility became a member of my external advisory board. And they came and we started having serious discussions about what does it take to ramp thermal units. What does it take to integrate renewable energy resources? They now have over 2,000 megawatts of wind on our system. They now have exceeded the mandate, which was originally 10%. The legislature upped it to 20%, and we're already there 3 years early, 4 years early. And there's times on their system where they have 50% of the generations coming from renewables. Okay? And what they've done is they've embraced the idea that this state requires that we do this. There are other states that don't, but this state requires that we do this, and they put it in the rate base. I mean, as a rate payer, I pay for this. And so it's not new taxes to the state, it's taxes to the electricity cost. Now the good news is we've still got low electricity costs because, again, we were primarily fossil fuel, and we still are primarily fossil fuel. We're like 50 or 55% now of coal. They have become that utility has morphed into a utility that no longer is afraid of this future, and they have embraced. I mean, again, they partner with our laboratory, which was pretty much unheard of before. And now, you go on the billboards, all say, XL, promoting renewable energy, promoting solar. Let's do solar, let's do it right. There's a thing we're calling net energy metering in the country, and that's where, as a rooftop solar owner, I now, I run the meter backwards whenever I'm generating electricity, and I only use the system when I need it, all right? Utility's saying, now wait a second, I get too many of those people on here. All of a sudden now my infrastructure costs are spread over the remaining piece, and these folks are getting a free ride. I mean, that's what the utility is saying. They're right. That's absolutely true. The business model needs to change. And where I kind of signed up for my solar thing and I want to have that solar deal to keep generating money for me, at the same time, I got to think about this broader perspective. And so as a consequence, I've worked with the electricity folks. I've worked with our public regulators, and our head of the PUC has asked me to help him do a public hearing on net energy metering, and let's have a sophisticated conversation. Let's let the utility get the returns on investment that their investors and shareholders require, and not disadvantage this notion that we want to go to a much more distributed energy mix in the future. How do we do that? I mean, that's a hard question, and it requires that we make this change. So, the long story short, we built a relationship with a utility. It's a major utility with a great deal of influence in the sector. Not all utilities think that way. You can go to California, the utilities do think that way. You can go to the Southeast, and they don't think that way. But you begin to see these things in regions of the country working, and the sky didn't fall, and the earth didn't end as we know it, and all of a sudden people start recognizing that there are other options. So I think it's a grassroots thing will actually take time and take hold. You've got to work with those that are more progressive. You've got to work with those who are willing to do it. And once they are, I think then you have an existence proof. But it's got to be a partnership. If you don't, I believe that the incumbents, whether the oil companies or the utilities, need to be part of the solution. I do not believe that you need to polarize this thing and make them all part of the problem. They're just trying to survive, and that's okay. I mean, some people would argue with that assessment, but those that are obscenely rich, maybe I don't have as much sympathy for those. But for those that are essentially trying to make sure that they do right by their shareholders in a responsible way, I think there is a way in which this can happen. I think the future is inevitable. We've got to go the distributed resources route. And the business models have to change to accommodate that. Ultimately, we will get there. The question is, we don't have a lot of time. These investments in the energy infrastructure take decades. And in some of these cases, these are 50-year sorts of decisions. When you build a new coal power plant, it's 50 years. You build a new nuclear plant in the U.S., it's 100 years. We're doing 30 years plus 30 years plus 30 years now in terms of longevity of nuclear power plants. That's a 90-year commitment. So we ought to at least be thoughtful about how we make those investments. And I think that's really where the conversation needs to be here. Yes, sir.
I just wanted to ask you about a possible driver that might be a bit of a game changer, and that's in terms of litigation driving change, particularly in terms of toxicity in the environment from fossil fuels, the pollution of aquifers. We're seeing in China, in extreme cases, not only people having trouble breathing, but the photochemical smog leading to ozone, interfering with plant photosynthesis. Now, obviously, it's not as extreme in the US, but I just wondered if you could talk about whether you see any possible drivers in that area, because if litigation does take place, that could really force the issue in terms of raising the cost of existing fossil fuel users or maybe increasing support for renewables.
Yeah, I don't have as much to say about that. I don't know much about, I mean, in the U.S., EPA is kind of the police watchdog sort of agency, and they really are incredibly controversial. The administrations, whether they're on the R side or the D side, tend to use them as a political instrument. I don't think it's helpful. I can't imagine that litigation is the right way to approach these things. But in fact, it could very well be that tends to be the outcome. I would hope that we have much more enlightened public elected officials who would want to go toward a future that everybody is more in alignment with what needs to happen. So I think pollution and all those kinds of things, no local pollutions, are very, very important in terms of, in addition to water use, which is another huge deal. And those are all, I think, very important in terms of how we kind of move together over the next few steps.
Well, let's thank Dan again.
Yeah, thank you.